What's going on, everyone? Today I'm back with the Axial Wraith 1.9. Now, you saw my first look video at it, and then I had it out on the rocks. It's a very capable little truck. You know, the Wraith cage is one that we're very familiar with. I'm pretty familiar with how it drives, and then the AR-44 axles and everything underneath, of course, I'm very familiar with. So it's a nimble little crawler. I had a lot of fun out on the rocks down in Southern California with it, but now it's back here in the shop and I'm ready to do a little customization and personalization of it. Now, after having this out on the rocks, there was a couple of things that I wanted to change pretty quickly. One was the tires, and the second is the shocks. Now, the SCX-10 shocks that come on this are the same shocks that we've seen used time and time again. We know them. They're a shock that gets the job done, but they're not the best quality shock. So that is something that I'm going to change. And today I'm going to put on the Incision 90mm scale shocks. I'm going to go through my process of filling and bleeding those and getting those mounted onto the vehicle. And then the second thing that I'm going to change is the tires. Now, I was down on a really loose sandy rock, and that doesn't do any tire any favors, but it's still a ready to run compound tire for Axial, which isn't the stickiest anyway. So it's something that I want to change. And while I'm at it, I'm going to change the wheels. I've had good luck baking tires off of stock Axial plastic wheels in the past, but I'm not going to go through that process for this one. I'm going to change the wheels and tires. I'm going to go with the Proline BFG Krawler tires in the Predator compound. I like these tires a lot. I've used them in the past quite a bit, but I've never used the Predator compound in them. Really soft, but it does have a really soft foam, so I'm gonna have to change that foam out at a later date. But for the wheels, I'm gonna go with the new Vanquish MR310 wheels in a clear finish with a black beadlock ring. Should give a great look to this vehicle. I'm also using a 350 hub all the way around. 350 refers to the offset, gives you a pretty close to stock width. If you wanted to go really close to stock width, you can use a 225 hub. And additionally, I'm also going to use the 1.9 stainless brake weight on the front of these, nothing in the rear. Installing tires and wheels, very simple process, not going to cover that, but I am going to go through my process of filling and bleeding the Incision shocks on this. Additionally, I'm also going to change out the shock shaft that comes on the Incision shocks with the black diamond option shock shafts that you can also get on the Vanquish website. This isn't a needed upgrade, it's just a shock shaft that is a little bit more slippery, and it's got a black look, which is just kind of a cool little accent or upgrade for those of you who really pay attention. But anyway, I'm going to go through those steps, get them mounted onto this, and then change out the wheels and tires. At the end, it'll give us a new look to our Axial Wraith. Since I'm changing out this polished shock shaft with the black diamond shaft, I have to do a couple of extra steps. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the lower spring cup, which is a captured design to the rod end. So using a 2mm driver, I can remove that screw, which will allow me to pull that spring cup off. Then we can remove the spring. And now I'm going to remove the top cap. To remove the top cap, I'm going to use my shock shaft pliers and just hold the base around near where the bottom seal is. Then I'm going to put my driver through the top cap and then just give it a little bit of twist. Next, I need to remove the lower rod end from the shock shaft so I can remove it. Again, you don't need to do this step if you're not changing out the shock shaft. We're going to use our shock shaft pliers to hold the shock shaft from spinning. Don't use too much force where you're going to mar the shaft, but hold it firmly and then you can rotate the lower rod end. With the rod end removed, we can now pull the shock shaft out through the top of the shock body. Next, we need to remove the E-clip so we can pull off the piston and the small washer underneath of it and transfer it onto our black diamond shaft. If you've never worked with C-clips like this before, be careful. They have a tendency to shoot across the room. Try and pull it off inside of a bag or somewhere where you can keep it protected because you will lose these. I'm putting the whole shock shaft inside of a plastic bag, and then I'm just going to actually pry it off through the outside so I cannot lose it. Now we can replace the polished shaft with the black diamond shaft. The small aluminum washer goes on the shock shaft first, followed by our shock piston. The beveled edge of the shock piston goes down. Then the C-clip goes onto the top of the shock shaft, and you can install it with a set of needle nose pliers. Again, be super careful. If you've never done this, try and do it inside of something so you can't lose it. Make sure that that C-clip is well engaged. If it's not fully engaged, your shock piston will actually pop off and your whole shock can come apart. So after triple checking it, I'm confident with this and I can install it back into the shock body. Before installing it, I'm going to loosen this bottom cartridge to take some of the pressure off of the X-rings in this lower cartridge. Then I'm going to apply a little bit of Team Associated's green slime to the threads on the end of this shock shaft to allow it to slide more easily through the bottom cartridge so that you don't damage any seals. Apply this liberally, it's not that expensive, and it's a lot better than tearing a seal. So with the shock shaft coated, the lower cartridge loosened up a little bit, we can gently slide this through the bottom of the shock body. Shock shaft's in place now. Tighten up that lower cartridge. Wipe off any excess of the green slime from around the bottom of the shock shaft, and we can reinstall our lower rod end. Tighten it up by hand, then grab your shock shaft pliers again. Hold firmly so that it doesn't rotate in the shock shaft pliers, but not so firmly to mar the shaft. Next, we need to fill the shock body with oil. For this, I'm going to be using TLR 60 weight oil. We're initially going to fill this not even close to halfway, maybe a third of the way or so, just to get it started and to try and get some of that initial air out of the bottom side of this shock. Once you get it filled partially, move the shock shaft slowly, get some of the air out of the bottom of there. Don't bring the shock piston out of the oil, just keep an eye on it down in there. Move it till you don't see any more bubbles coming out. Then before filling the shock body further, I'm gonna take and put on the lower spring cup. The shock shaft actually won't travel all the way until the rod end buries into this lower cartridge. So if you reinstall the lower shock cup, it'll give you a better idea of how far you need to fill this so that you don't end up over pressurizing the shock. So with this lower spring cup installed, you fill the shock and move it around to get all the air out, and basically you want it so that the level of the oil is just at the height of where the piston comes to when the shock is fully compressed. If you overfill it, you'll end up pressurizing that shock, and that's when you end up blowing oil out the bottom side of this cartridge. For reference, with the shock shaft completely extended, you only want to fill the shock until it's about 8 to 10 millimeters from the top of this. That way, when your shock compresses, the displacement of that shock shaft in the body raises the fluid until that level that we're looking at. Now that we've got this filled to where we want it, we need to remove this bladder from the top of the cap. I don't recommend using tools to remove this. I would just use your fingers so that you don't tear that bladder. Then we're going to take this bladder and we're going to insert it in there. You won't be able to push the bladder all the way down into the body because it needs to move up into the cap slightly as the shock compresses to work properly. So pull it to the side and then slowly extend the shock shaft. About halfway, I release it and then continue pulling it down. Then we're going to thread back on the cap. Now we've got a really smooth feeling shock shaft, and then if we go all the way down, it does want to suck back in just a very small amount. But this should mean that we're not over compressing the fluid and we shouldn't blow out the seals on the bottom of our shock. Now I'm going to pull off that lower spring cup again and replace the spring. And then I'm going to replace the lower spring cup retaining screw. So now our shock feels super consistent, no air bubbles, no overpressurizing, and with a cool look of those black shock shafts. To mount these shocks into the Wraith, I'm going to be using the included upper pivot balls that come on the plastic parts tree in the package. This upper pivot will go into the top of the shock cap, and then we'll just run our screw through it just like the stock shock. Now for the fun part. We get to remove the wheels and tires from the build using a 7mm nut driver on the wheel nuts, and then our 2mm driver to remove the lower and upper shock mounting screw. An important note, it does appear that there's a 4 or 5mm spacer behind the upper shock screw on the front of this vehicle as well as the rear. So make sure you don't lose that and replace it when you're reinstalling your new shocks. I'm going to reinstall my shocks moved back one hole to the furthest rearward mounting hole. It'll lower the ride height just a little bit. Now we can get a good look of those new shocks in place compared to the stock ones. Definitely a nice upgrade. Moving to the rear, of course, we need to remove the wheels and tires again. Using one of the Krawler Innovation short blocks to hold the rig in place now. Now, to get to this top shock screw, Technically the body's in the way, but you can just kind of force that up out of the way if you don't feel like removing the body completely. It's not going to hurt anything. Again, watch that you don't lose that spacer. And in the rear, I'm going to move the shock to the forwardmost position of the shock mount. Again, lower the ride height just a little bit. So now my rig looks slightly different than stock and it feels great. Can't wait to get these new Predator compound tires out on the rocks. Really looking forward to seeing how these do. Love these tires normally, but this is a new compound that I've never tried in this tire. But with that upgrade done, we can start planning our next one. This truck does use a mix and match of things that we have seen in other trucks before, but it definitely has its own feel. For those that said before that, well, this isn't a Wraith anymore, it should be called something different. The Wraith name comes from the chassis. This is a replica of the full-size rig that was called the Wraith. So that's more what it looks like. That's why it's still called a Wraith. And these axles look very proportionate under this, probably more so than the full-size AR60s did. Granted, I really liked the AR60 size Wraith, had a blast with it, and I like AR60s for a lot of reasons. But this truck, another one that kind of fits more in the realm of popularity of 1.9 trucks nowadays. So I get why they did it. I really like it. I'm really looking forward to doing all kinds of stuff with it. So if you guys have things that you would like to see done to it, not including adding 2.2s and bigger axles, absolutely comment below with whatever you guys would like to see. I've got some ideas already. Gonna start gathering some parts and putting some things aside to start installing onto it. But if you guys have suggestions of things that you would like to see in upcoming videos, absolutely drop them in the comments below. I appreciate them. I appreciate all the comments, all the feedback you guys give. But as always, if you liked the video, hit that button. If you didn't, there's a button for that too. Also, make sure to subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see them as soon as they get uploaded. But with all that being said, thanks for watching and we'll see you on the next one.